London is shrouded in fog. Where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones, like the video, and subscribe. Let's begin. It was upon a raw November morning, when the fog lay thick as wool upon the streets and the gas lamps glimmered like half-forgotten stars, that Sherlock Holmes first directed my attention to the matter which I now record with a reluctance born not of faded memory, but of lingering unease. Many cases had passed through our hands in Baker Street, cases of cruelty, greed, jealousy, and cunning. Yet none, I confess, left upon my mind so enduring and uncomfortable an impression as this one. I write of it now, not merely as a chronicler of Holmes's methods, but as a man compelled to examine his own trust, admiration, and the frailty that may hide within even the sharpest intellect. Holmes was seated, as was his custom during intervals of reflection, in the deep armchair beside the fire, his long fingers steepled, his eyes half closed, and his chin sunk upon his chest. The violin lay untouched upon the table, a sign I had come to recognize as indicating a mind occupied with matters of uncommon interest. I had been perusing the morning papers, idly at first, until a small paragraph buried among advertisements and foreign correspondence caught my eye. Bloomsbury murder, it read, in the stark and unemotional prose of the press. Mr. Septimus Green, antiquarian and private scholar, found dead in his rooms at Montague Place late last evening. Circumstances appear suspicious. A clerk, known to have quarrelled with the deceased, is in police custody. I read the passage aloud, more to fill the silence than from any sense of its importance. Holmes's eyes opened at once. "Read that again, Watson," he said quietly. I obliged, adding such minor details as the newspaper provided: the hour of discovery, the absence of forced entry, the presence of a blunt instrument believed to be the weapon. Holmes rose and began pacing the room, his slippers soundless upon the rug. "Bloomsbury," he murmured. "Antiquarians do not, as a rule, die violently unless they traffic in more than books and broken marbles." "You think this murder is out of the ordinary?" I asked. "I think," he replied, "that it is ordinary in precisely the way which conceals what is extraordinary." Before I could press him further, there came a sharp knock at the door, followed almost immediately by the entrance of Inspector Lestrade, whose expression bore that mixture of confidence and irritation which so often accompanied his visits to Baker Street. He wasted no time in pleasantries. "I thought you'd want to hear it from me first, Mr. Holmes," he said. "We've a clear case on our hands. The fellow's as good as hanged." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. Pray, enlighten us." Lestrade produced a notebook and consulted it with theatrical emphasis. "Name of Edgar Miles, age 32, clerk to a shipping firm in Limehouse, known associate of the deceased. They quarrelled, loudly, I'm told, 2 nights before the murder. Witnesses heard raised voices. Miles was seen entering Green's building shortly after 9 last night and leaving in some agitation before 10. Green was found dead at 10:30 by his housekeeper. The weapon? A bronze paperweight belonging to the victim. Miles's fingerprints, if you'll pardon the term, are all over it. I noticed Holmes's lips curve ever so slightly, though whether in amusement or skepticism I could not at that moment determine. "And motive?" Holmes asked. "Money," said Lestrade promptly. Green had lent him a sum some months ago. Wanted it repaid. Miles couldn't manage it. That's when the quarrel began. Holmes turned to me. Watson, you observe the admirable symmetry of it all. Lestrade bristled. Symmetry or no, it's solid. The man's alibi is rubbish. Claims he left early, but no one saw him afterward. Ah, said Holmes softly. No one saw him afterward. That afternoon found us threading our way through the fog-bound streets of Bloomsbury. The neighborhood possessed an academic quiet, its tall terraces and narrow lanes inhabited by scholars, widows, and booksellers. Montague Place stood a little apart, a row of sober houses whose uniformity seemed to frown upon deviation of any kind. Mr. Green's rooms occupied the second floor. They were cramped but orderly, lined from floor to ceiling, with shelves that bowed beneath the weight of ancient volumes. The smell of dust and old leather permeated the air. The body had been removed, yet the violence of the act remained evident in the dark stain upon the carpet and the disordered furniture. Holmes moved slowly, almost languidly, his gaze travelling from shelf to shelf, from desk to window, from hearth to door. I observed, not for the first time, how his attention seemed to alight upon details which my own eye would have dismissed as trivial. The angle of a chair, the faint scuff upon the floor, the position of a curtain cord. The paperweight, Holmes said at last. Where was it found? Lestrade indicated the desk. Holmes examined it closely, then turned it in his hands. A common enough object, he remarked, yet its base is scratched. It was used as a weapon, Lestrade replied impatiently. Possibly, Holmes said, or possibly it was handled with some urgency before it ever struck flesh. We were next introduced to Edgar Miles, who sat pale and rigid in a small room at the station. He was a slight man, with narrow shoulders and an expression of weary bewilderment. When Holmes spoke to him, it was with a gentleness that surprised me. You knew Mr. Green well? Yes, sir, Miles replied. He was difficult, brilliant, but difficult. You argued? Yes, about the money, but I left before anything happened. I swear it. Holmes studied him in silence. I saw no flicker of deceit, only fear, raw and unguarded. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, I ventured an observation. He seems an unlikely murderer. Holmes did not answer at once. He stood by the window, gazing out into the swirling fog. Unlikely men commit crimes every day, Watson, he said at last. What interests me is not whether he could have done it, but whether he must have done it. I felt a chill at his words, though I could not then have said why. The case appeared straightforward, even inevitable, yet some faint discord lingered in my mind. It was as though a familiar melody had been played a half note out of tune. As I write this now, I recognize that moment as the first whisper of doubt, a whisper I failed at the time to heed. The days that followed settled into a bleak routine, as though London itself had accepted the grim verdict toward which events seemed inexorably to move. The fog lingered, thickening in the mornings and returning with stubborn persistence at dusk, wrapping the city in a grey shroud that dulled sound and spirit alike. Holmes and I continued our inquiries, yet even as we pursued them, I could not escape the impression that the case was already, in the minds of the authorities, concluded. Edgar Miles was the man. All that remained was the formal procession toward judgment. Holmes, however, did not abandon his habits simply because others had done so. Each morning he reviewed the evidence afresh, spreading notes across the table in our sitting room, tapping his fingers together in that familiar rhythm which accompanied his more intense periods of thought. I observed him closely, hoping to glimpse some spark of doubt or contradiction, yet his demeanour remained calm, almost detached. "Lestrade is confident," I remarked one morning, as Holmes examined a sheaf of statements. "The Crown seems eager to proceed." "Yes," Holmes replied. "Confidence is often inversely proportional to comprehension." Despite this remark, Holmes did not express any overt challenge to the prevailing narrative. Instead, he immersed himself in the particulars of Edgar Miles's life. We visited the shipping office in Limehouse where the man was employed, a dreary establishment overlooking the river, its windows perpetually smeared with soot. Miles's employer described him as punctual, quiet, and unambitious, a man who neither inspired loyalty nor aroused suspicion. He kept to himself, the clerk told us, never caused trouble. If he owed money, it surprises me. Holmes made a note. "Men of modest means often borrow from acquaintances rather than banks," he said. "It preserves dignity, at least in theory." We next sought out those who had witnessed the quarrel between Miles and the deceased. The scene, as described by several residents of Montague Place, had been heated but brief. Voices were raised, accusations exchanged. Yet no one could say precisely what words were spoken, nor whether the argument ended in threat or merely frustration. "Arguments," Holmes observed as we walked away, "are among the most unreliable indicators of murder. Nearly everyone argues, comparatively few kill. Still, the evidence accumulated with merciless efficiency. The housekeeper testified that Miles was the last visitor. A pawnbroker produced a receipt suggesting that Miles had recently sold a small antique, a gift, he claimed, from Mr. Green himself. Lestrade interpreted this as proof of desperation. The most damning element, however, lay in Holmes's own examination of the physical evidence. He returned again to the bronze paperweight, scrutinizing its weight, its balance, the faint discoloration along its edge. "A blow delivered from behind," he concluded one evening, as I watched him test its heft. "Quick, decisive. The assailant knew where to strike." "You believe Miles capable of that?" I asked. Holmes did not answer directly. "Capability is not character, Watson. One need not be violent by nature to commit violence under pressure." The trial commenced with unsettling speed. I attended several sessions, seated beside Holmes as the prosecution laid out its case with ruthless clarity. Witness followed witness. Each statement reinforced the last. Miles sat pale and trembling, his eyes darting nervously toward the jury, then toward Holmes, as though seeking some unspoken reassurance. When Holmes was called to testify, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. His reputation preceded him, lending weight to every word he spoke. He described the scene with precision, outlining the sequence of events as he believed them to have occurred. His deductions were delivered calmly, without flourish, yet their cumulative effect was devastating. I watched Edgar Miles as Holmes spoke. The man's shoulders sagged, his expression collapsing into something like resignation. It was as though the final door had closed. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, I could no longer contain my unease. "You were certain," I said. "In court?" "Yes. Holmes replied, hanging his coat. "Certainty is expected of an expert witness." "But were you convinced?" I pressed. Holmes paused, his hand resting upon the back of his chair. For a moment, I thought he might confide some lingering doubt. Instead, he shook his head. "The evidence is coherent," he said. "That does not mean it is complete." It was a curious remark, and one that lingered with me long after Holmes retired for the night. The following morning brought an unexpected development. A letter arrived, bearing no return address. The handwriting was careful, almost scholarly. "You are wrong," it read simply. "Look again at what you dismissed." Holmes read it twice, his expression unreadable. He then folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocket. "A crank," I suggested. "Possibly," he replied, "or possibly a conscience." We returned once more to Bloomsbury, this time with Holmes's attention fixed upon details he had previously passed over. He examined the shelves again, the desk, the window. He questioned the housekeeper anew, probing gently at inconsistencies in her recollection of times and sounds. "You said you heard a noise at 9:30, Holmes said. "Yes, sir." "And yet you did not enter the room until an hour later." "I was frightened," she replied. Holmes nodded, but I could see his mind at work, rearranging the familiar elements into new patterns. Outside, he paused beside the entrance, studying the street. "Watson," he said slowly, "tell me, if a man wished to be seen entering a house, but not necessarily committing a crime, how might he arrange matters?" I frowned. "I suppose he might make his presence obvious. Argue loudly, perhaps." "Precisely." The implication struck me with sudden force, and I felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. Holmes turned away, his face grave. "The trouble," he said, "is that once a narrative is established, it acquires a momentum of its own. To oppose it requires not only evidence, but courage." As we walked back toward Baker Street, the city seemed altered to my eyes, its streets more labyrinthine, its shadows deeper. Edgar Miles awaited his fate, the machinery of justice grinding forward without pause. And somewhere, perhaps, another intelligence observed us, confident that its work remained unseen. I could not escape the sense that we stood upon the edge of a far greater error than any of us yet understood. The sentence was passed on a Thursday, beneath a sky so low and colourless that it seemed to press upon the very roof of the Old Bailey. Edgar Miles was found guilty of murder and condemned to hang. The words fell with a dreadful finality, yet I observed that Holmes, seated beside me, neither stirred nor altered his expression. Only later did I realize that this stillness was not acceptance, but restraint, the outward calm of a mind already straining against its own conclusions. Miles received the verdict with a quiet nod, as though some private struggle had already exhausted his capacity for outward emotion. His eyes sought Holmes's once more, but this time there was no appeal in them, only a bleak acknowledgement, as if he had resigned himself to the judgment not merely of the court, but of the man whose intellect he had trusted most. That evening, Baker Street felt unusually oppressive. The familiar comfort of our rooms, the worn carpet, the chemical clutter upon the side table, the faint smell of tobacco, offered me no solace. Holmes sat for a long while without speaking, gazing into the fire. At last, he rose and began pacing, his steps sharp and deliberate. "I testified honestly," he said at last. "Every word I spoke was grounded in observation and inference." "I know," I replied. "And yet," he continued. Honesty does not preclude error. It was the first admission of its kind I had ever heard from him. I waited, scarcely daring to breathe. That letter, he went on, was not written in ignorance. Whoever sent it understood enough of the case to know precisely where my attention failed. Failed? I echoed. Holmes halted and turned toward me. Neglected, perhaps, is the better word. There are details one dismisses because they do not fit the dominant hypothesis. That is not poor reasoning, it is human reasoning, but it can be exploited. The following morning, we resumed our investigations, not openly, but with a renewed sense of urgency. Holmes instructed me to make discreet inquiries among the scholarly circles of Bloomsbury, while he himself vanished into the city for hours at a time, returning only after nightfall with little to say. My own inquiries led me to several acquaintances of Septimus Green, the murdered antiquarian. What emerged was a portrait more complex than the solitary scholar described by the newspapers. Green had been engaged in a private project of some significance, though none could say precisely what it entailed. He was secretive, even suspicious, and had recently severed ties with at least 2 fellow researchers following acrimonious disputes. One does not quarrel so bitterly over footnotes, one colleague remarked dryly. I relayed this information to Holmes, who received it with keen interest. Green's disputes, he said, are more revealing than Miles's. We returned yet again to Montague Place, this time gaining access to Green's papers, which had been overlooked by the police as irrelevant. Holmes examined them with painstaking care, page by page, his brow furrowed. "Here," he said suddenly, holding up a notebook. "Do you see this?" I peered over his shoulder. The page was filled with cramped handwriting, notes in Latin and Greek, references to obscure manuscripts. "A code?" I ventured. "Not a code," Holmes replied. "A shorthand. Green was concealing something, but not from thieves, from colleagues." The more Holmes uncovered, the more the case seemed to widen rather than narrow. References to private collections, to meetings conducted under assumed names, to transactions conducted in cash, all suggested a hidden network beneath the respectable surface of Bloomsbury's academic world. And yet, none of it directly exonerated Edgar Miles. The anonymous letters continued, arriving at irregular intervals. Each was brief, precise, and unsettlingly perceptive. You saw the argument, but not its purpose. The witness spoke truthfully, but not completely. You trust the weapon because it is obvious. Holmes read them in silence, then burned them in the grate. "These letters are not taunts," he said. "They are corrections." It was during this period that Holmes paid an unexpected visit to the prison. He returned late, his face drawn. "Miles maintains his innocence?" I asked. "He does," Holmes replied. "And more troubling still, he understands why he was convicted." I stared at him. "How can that be troubling?" "Because he accepts my reasoning," Holmes said quietly. "He believes the logic that condemns him. That suggests the logic is sound, but perhaps incomplete." The realization struck me with force. A flawed argument may be resisted, but a perfect argument built upon false premises is far more dangerous. One night, unable to sleep, I found Holmes seated at his desk, surrounded by papers, diagrams scrawled across sheets in his angular hand. "Watson," he said without looking up, "do you recall the scratch upon the base of the paperweight?" Of course. What if it was not caused by impact? He asked. Then by what? By placement, Holmes replied. Repeated placement. A habit. He rose and retrieved a book from the shelf, placing the paperweight upon it. Observe, he said, how the bronze marks the leather. Green used this object frequently, not merely as decoration, but as a tool. For what purpose? To hold something in place, Holmes said. Something he did not wish disturbed. The implication was tantalizing, yet frustratingly incomplete. Holmes, for once, did not rush to articulate his conclusions. Instead, he seemed haunted by the possibility that he had been guided, step by step, toward a conclusion someone else desired. The final letter of that week arrived with a different tone. Time is your enemy now. Holmes crushed the paper in his hand. Whoever orchestrated this, he said, anticipated not only my deductions, but my doubts. That suggests a mind acquainted with my methods. And such a mind, I added slowly, would know precisely how to lead you astray. Holmes met my gaze, his expression grave. Yes, Watson, he said, and that is what troubles me most. As the days passed and the date of execution drew nearer, the pressure mounted. The city seemed indifferent, the machinery of justice grinding on. Yet beneath the surface, in the shadows of Bloomsbury and the quiet corners of Baker Street, a different contest was unfolding. A contest not merely to solve a crime, but to undo a certainty. And at its center stood Sherlock Holmes, confronting for the first time the possibility that his greatest adversary was not a criminal at large, but a mistake already made. The prison lay beneath a sky the color of old pewter, its walls sweating with damp, its corridors echoing with the hollow finality of footsteps that led nowhere but inward. I accompanied Holmes on his second visit to see Edgar Miles, though this time my friend had insisted upon utmost discretion. No inspector attended us. No official record would note the interview. Holmes had arranged it through channels I did not inquire into, and I had learned long ago that such arrangements were best left unexplored. Miles was brought in, thinner than before, his complexion dulled by confinement and despair. Yet there was a curious composure about him, a stillness that struck me as incongruous with his situation. He greeted Holmes with a slight inclination of the head. "You have come again," he said quietly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "I owe you that much." Miles gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Holmes. You did what any honest man would do with the facts before him." Holmes studied him intently. "And you still maintain your innocence?" "I do," Miles said without hesitation, "but I no longer expect to be believed." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a weary acceptance that unsettled me more than protest ever could. Holmes leaned forward. "Tell me again," he said, "exactly what transpired on the night Mr. Green died. Do not omit anything, however trivial it may seem." Miles closed his eyes for a moment, as though arranging his thoughts with care. When he spoke, his account was steady, consistent with what he had said before, yet enriched by detail. "I went to see him to explain that I could not repay the money yet," he said. "He was angry, but not violent. He accused me of ingratitude, of wasting my time and his. He spoke of his work, always his work, and said I was beneath it. I left because I could not bear to listen any longer." "At what hour?" Holmes asked. "Just before 10, Miles replied. "I remember the clock striking." And after you left? I walked aimlessly, Miles said. I do not know for how long. I crossed the river. I stood watching the barges. No one saw me because no one wished to. Holmes nodded slowly. When you argued, did Mr. Green threaten you? No, Miles said. He threatened to expose me, to tell my employer of my debt. He knew I could not afford to lose my position. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Expose you, or something else? Miles hesitated. I do not know. He spoke vaguely. He enjoyed that. When the interview ended, Holmes rose abruptly. You are a man who has been placed precisely where another wished him to be, he said. I do not yet know how, but I will. Miles looked up at him, hope flickering briefly before being smothered by caution. If you find the truth, he said, do not hurry on my account. Hurry because it is the truth. Outside the prison walls, Holmes remained silent for some time. At last, he spoke. Watson, consider this. Miles had motive, opportunity, and apparent means, yet he lacks one thing essential to the crime. And what is that? I asked. Conviction, Holmes replied. Not legal conviction, but personal resolve. He did not cross a threshold that night with murder in his heart. But that is intuition, I protested. You have often warned me against it. Indeed, Holmes said, which is why I must find evidence to support it. Our next line of inquiry took us deeper into the life of Septimus Green. Holmes had obtained permission, of a sort, to examine Green's private correspondence, which had been boxed and stored pending probate. We spent an entire afternoon sorting through letters, receipts, and marginal notes. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Green had been corresponding with an individual who signed himself only as R. The letters were courteous, formal, and deeply erudite, discussing manuscripts, provenance, and the ethics of acquisition. Yet beneath the scholarly tone ran a current of tension, even veiled threat. This R challenges Green repeatedly, Holmes observed, questions his claims, demands proof. And Green responds defensively, I added, almost fearfully. Holmes nodded. Green possessed something of value, intellectual or material, and feared its loss. That fear shaped his behavior. Among the papers, we discovered a curious omission, a ledger referenced in multiple letters but nowhere to be found. Missing, Holmes murmured, and yet central. We turned next to the witnesses whose testimonies had seemed so solid. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alder, received us with visible discomfort. Holmes questioned her gently, circling familiar ground until inconsistencies emerged. Not lies, precisely, but hesitations. You said you heard nothing between 9:30 and 10:30, Holmes said. Yes, sir. And yet, Holmes continued, you were awake. I was sewing, she said. Then you would have heard the door, Holmes pressed. This house echoes. Mrs. Alder wrung her hands. I may have dozed. Or you may have heard something you did not understand, Holmes said quietly. Her eyes flickered, and for a moment I thought she might confess something of consequence. Instead, she shook her head. I heard nothing, she insisted. As we left, Holmes's expression was grim. She is not concealing a murderer, he said. She is concealing uncertainty. Another witness, the neighbor who had reported hearing raised voices, proved equally unsatisfactory. He admitted, under Holmes's probing, that he had assumed the argument involved Miles because he recognized his voice from previous encounters. Assumption, Holmes said afterward, is the bedrock of error. Yet for all this, we still lacked the one thing that might stay the execution, incontrovertible proof. The anonymous correspondent reappeared, as if sensing our frustration. "You search among the innocent and the ignorant," the letter read. "Look instead to those who knew the rules." Holmes read it with a tightening jaw. "This man, or woman, knows the academic world," he said. "Knows its rivalries, its methods of concealment." "Could it be one of Green's colleagues?" I asked. "Possibly," Holmes replied, "or someone who studied under him." The thought was unsettling. An adversary not lurking in alleyways, but seated in libraries, not wielding knives, but wielding knowledge. That night, Holmes spread out a map of Bloomsbury upon the table. "Observe," he said, marking points with his finger. "Green's rooms, the witness's vantage, Miles's route. Everything aligns too neatly." "Too neatly," I echoed. "Yes," Holmes said. "The crime was staged to be read in a particular way. It assumes a reader, one who draws conclusions." I felt a chill. "You." "Precisely," Holmes said. "The murderer did not merely kill a man. He constructed a narrative and trusted me to complete it." Outside, the fog crept once more along the street, blurring edges, swallowing distinctions. Somewhere within it walked a mind that had anticipated Holmes's every step, that had counted upon his brilliance and used it as a weapon. And Edgar Miles sat in his cell, condemned by a logic that might yet prove impeccable and fatally wrong. As Holmes extinguished the lamp, he spoke one final thought into the darkness. "The most dangerous errors," he said, "are those that survive examination." I lay awake long into the night, haunted by the notion that justice itself might be manipulated, not by ignorance or malice alone, but by reason turned subtly aside. Holmes rose later than usual the following morning, a circumstance so rare that it immediately signaled to me the depth of his nocturnal labours. The fire had burned low, leaving only a red glow among the embers, and the air of our sitting room was heavy with the mingled scents of tobacco ash and chemical reagents. When at last he emerged from his bedroom, his face bore the pallor of prolonged concentration rather than fatigue, and his eyes shone with that peculiar brightness which always preceded some decisive movement of thought. "Watson," he said without preamble, "we have been looking at this case from the wrong elevation." I set aside my breakfast and gave him my full attention. "In what way?" "We have examined actions," Holmes replied, pouring himself coffee. "Movements, times, quarrels, witnesses. But this crime was not conceived in action. It was conceived in intellect." He spread several papers upon the table, copies of Green's correspondence, notes from our interviews, and a list of names I recognized from my own inquiries among Bloomsbury's academic circles. "Septimus Green," Holmes continued, "was not merely an antiquarian. He was a gatekeeper." "A gatekeeper?" I repeated. "To knowledge," Holmes said, "or more precisely, to legitimacy. Green advised collectors, authenticated manuscripts, and determined provenance. His word could elevate a scrap of parchment into a treasure, or consign it to obscurity." I began to see the outline of his argument. "And that would give him power." "Exactly," Holmes said. "Power enough to make enemies who would never appear in a police ledger." Our attention settled upon one name in particular, Reginald Hawthorne, a scholar of some repute, known for his brilliance and his caustic disdain for rivals. Hawthorne had corresponded frequently with Green, often disputing his conclusions with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "He signs himself R," Holmes said, tapping the page. And note the dates. Their correspondence grows more strained in the months preceding Green's death. Is Hawthorne capable of murder? I asked. Holmes looked at me sharply. Capability is irrelevant. Opportunity and intent are the questions. We arranged to call upon Hawthorne at his rooms near Russell Square. He received us cordially, though I detected at once a certain guardedness beneath his polished manners. He was a tall man, spare and angular, with sharp features and eyes that missed little. His rooms were orderly to the point of severity, every book aligned with mathematical precision. Mr. Green's death was a tragedy, Hawthorne said smoothly, a loss to scholarship. And yet you quarrelled with him, Holmes observed. Hawthorne smiled thinly. Scholars quarrel, Mr. Holmes. It is our profession. You accused him of fraud, Holmes said. Of error, Hawthorne corrected. There is a difference. Holmes studied him in silence, then gestured toward a stack of papers on the desk. You were working late on the night of the murder? Yes, Hawthorne replied readily. My landlady will attest to that. Alone? Holmes pressed. Entirely, Hawthorne said. As always. The interview yielded little of substance, yet as we departed, Holmes lingered by the door, examining a bronze object upon a side table, a paperweight, strikingly similar to the one found in Green's rooms. Common taste, Hawthorne remarked lightly, following his gaze. Or shared habit, Holmes replied. Outside, Holmes exhaled slowly. Hawthorne is dangerous, he said. Not because he is guilty, but because he is capable of understanding guilt as a construct. Days passed, each one bringing the execution closer. Holmes worked with increasing intensity, pursuing lines of inquiry that seemed, at times, to diverge wildly from the original crime. He examined auction records, private sales, academic disputes long forgotten by all but their participants. Gradually, a hidden network emerged, a world where reputations were traded, careers ruined, and truths buried beneath consensus. It was through this avenue that we encountered Clara Fenwick, a young researcher whose work had been publicly discredited by Green only a year before. She received us nervously, her eyes darting to the door as though expecting interruption. He destroyed me, she said bitterly, with a single letter. Why? Holmes asked. Because I challenged him, she replied. Because I proved him wrong. And did he acknowledge it? Holmes pressed. No, Fenwick said. He silenced me. Her testimony painted Green in a darker light, petty, vindictive, and deeply invested in maintaining his authority. Yet when Holmes asked directly whether she had wished him dead, she recoiled. I wanted justice, she said, not blood. Still, her account reinforced Holmes's growing conviction. Green's murder was not the act of passion suggested by the prosecution, but the culmination of an intellectual conflict. The anonymous letters ceased abruptly, as though their author sensed that further guidance was no longer necessary. Holmes seemed both relieved and unsettled by their absence. He is watching, Holmes said one night, waiting to see whether I will complete the circle. And if you do? I asked. Then Edgar Miles may yet live, Holmes replied. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through a detail so small I nearly overlooked it. While reviewing Green's papers once more, I noticed a faint indentation upon a desk blotter, a pattern consistent with a heavy object placed repeatedly in the same spot. The paperweight, I said. Holmes's eyes lit at once. Yes. And beneath it? We lifted the blotter carefully. Hidden beneath was a thin compartment, cleverly concealed, containing a folded ledger. Holmes examined it with reverence. "The missing ledger," he said. "At last." Its contents were damning, not of Miles, but of Green himself. Records of transactions, private sales of manuscripts of dubious provenance, payments received for favorable opinions. Green had been trafficking not merely in knowledge, but in influence. "This ledger is motive," Holmes said grimly, "and perhaps confession." As we stood there, the implications unfolded before us. Someone had wanted that ledger, wanted it enough to kill, and someone had arranged matters so that suspicion would fall elsewhere. Holmes closed the ledger carefully. "Now," he said, "we must determine who knew of this, and who knew that I would see what they wished me to see." Outside, the bells tolled the hour, their sound carrying across the fog-bound streets like a warning. Time was slipping away, and the truth, though closer than ever, remained tantalizingly out of reach. As we left Montague Place for the final time that night, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon us. Not the false inevitability of the verdict, but the inexorable pull of truth toward revelation. And yet, even as Holmes held the ledger in his grasp, I sensed that the most perilous stage of the case still lay ahead. For to uncover the truth was one thing, but to undo a judgment already passed was another entirely. The discovery of the ledger did not bring the immediate clarity I had expected. On the contrary, it seemed to thicken the atmosphere of uncertainty that already hung about the case like an unwholesome fog. Holmes carried the slim volume beneath his arm as we returned to Baker Street, guarding it with an almost proprietary care. Yet he did not open it again that night. Instead, he locked it away in the small iron strongbox beneath his desk, as though even its presence demanded a period of contemplation before it could be safely confronted. "You are unusually cautious," I remarked, as he turned the key with deliberate slowness. "I am unusually late," Holmes replied. "That is a far more dangerous condition." For the next 2 days, Holmes did nothing that appeared on the surface to advance the case. He made no visits, sent no urgent telegrams, and spoke little. He read, slowly and attentively, returning again and again to Green's correspondence, comparing dates, handwriting, ink, even the quality of paper. I watched him with growing impatience, conscious of the clock that was ticking inexorably toward Edgar Miles's execution. "Surely the ledger is enough," I protested at last. "It establishes motive beyond doubt." "Motive for murder," Holmes said calmly, "is meaningless without motive for this murder, conducted in this way and timed precisely as it was. Remember, Watson, we are not merely trying to prove that Green was corrupt. We must prove that someone killed him, and that I helped that person succeed." The bluntness of the remark unsettled me. Holmes rarely spoke of himself as an instrument in another's design, yet here he acknowledged it openly. On the third morning, Holmes at last opened the strongbox and laid the ledger upon the table. Together, we examined it page by page. The entries were meticulous, listing sums paid and received, names reduced to initials, dates matched to scholarly opinions later published as authoritative judgments. It was a map of influence, carefully concealed beneath the guise of academic rigor. "One must admire the man's thoroughness," Holmes remarked dryly. "Green anticipated exposure and prepared for it. though not, it seems, in the way he expected. "Who else knew of this ledger?" I asked. Holmes tapped a finger against the page. "That is the essential question. Green's habit was secrecy, but secrecy invites curiosity. Someone discovered this, perhaps by accident, and recognized its value." We turned our attention again to Reginald Hawthorne. Holmes arranged a second meeting, this time under the pretext of verifying certain references in Green's papers. Hawthorne received us with the same polished courtesy, though I noticed a subtle stiffening when Holmes produced a single page from the ledger, carefully chosen, I suspected, for its effect. "Do you recognize this?" Holmes asked. Hawthorne glanced at the page, then looked away almost immediately. "It appears to be an account," he said. "Of what relevance is it to me?" "Of considerable relevance," Holmes replied. "Your initial appears here, beside a payment corresponding to the publication date of your rebuttal to Fenwick's thesis." Hawthorne's smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened. "An accusation, Mr. Holmes." "An inquiry," Holmes said. "Nothing more." Hawthorne leaned back in his chair. "Green offered advice," he said. "That is all. I rejected it." "And yet the payment remains," Holmes said quietly. The tension in the room was palpable, though Hawthorne maintained his composure. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing," he said coolly, "I suggest you present it to the proper authorities." "We may yet do so," Holmes replied. As we left, Holmes's expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "He is not our man," he said. "At least, not alone." Our inquiries widened. Holmes sought out other scholars, collectors, and intermediaries whose names appeared, often only hinted at, in the ledger. Some denied knowledge outright, others admitted to dealings that skirted ethical boundaries but stopped short of violence. Again and again we encountered the same refrain. Green had been a tyrant in miniature, feared and resented, yet indispensable. The pattern was clear, yet the hand that had struck him down remained elusive. It was during this period that Lestrade paid us an unannounced visit. His usual brusqueness was tempered by a hint of discomfort. "I've been hearing things," he said. "Whispers about Green." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Whispers have a way of becoming statements," he said, "particularly when supported by documents." Lestrade's eyes widened as Holmes produced the ledger. He leafed through it, his expression darkening with each page. "This changes matters," he said slowly, "but it doesn't free your man." "No," Holmes agreed. "Not yet." "What do you need?" Lestrade asked. "Time," Holmes replied, "and discretion." Lestrade hesitated, then nodded. "I can give you a little of both, but the rope's already measured." That evening, as Holmes reviewed his notes, a knock sounded at the door. A young man stood outside, pale and visibly agitated. He introduced himself as Thomas Wren, a junior clerk employed by one of Green's associates. "I shouldn't be here," he said nervously, "but I saw something that night." Holmes ushered him in at once. "I was delivering papers," Wren continued. "I passed Montague Place just after 10. I saw a man leaving Green's building, not Miles. This man was taller, broader. He wore a scholar's coat, but he moved like someone accustomed to the streets." "Why did you not come forward earlier?" Holmes asked. Wren swallowed. "Because when I told my employer, he told me to forget it, said I'd imagined it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And now?" "And now I've heard an innocent man is to die," Wren said. "I couldn't forget it. The description was frustratingly vague, yet it cracked open the case at last. Holmes pressed Wren for every detail: the man's gait, the angle of his hat, the way he turned into the fog. Each fragment was weighed and catalogued. When Wren departed, Holmes sank into his chair, his expression grim but resolute. "Watson," he said, "we have confirmation of a second presence. That alone undermines the prosecution's certainty." "But will it be enough?" I asked. Holmes looked at the clock. "It must be." Late that night, the anonymous correspondent returned at last. "You are close," the letter read. "But remember, you were meant to be." Holmes held the paper for a long time before speaking. "This man," he said, "did not merely anticipate my deductions. He relied upon them. He counted on my reputation to sanctify his work." "Then he knows you," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied softly, "or he knows what I represent." As I retired that night, sleep eluded me. The ledger lay like a silent accusation beneath Holmes's desk. A witness had emerged, tentative but sincere. Yet the execution loomed nearer than ever. The truth, though finally stirring, seemed fragile, easily crushed beneath the weight of established belief. And in the shadows of London, the true architect of the crime waited, confident that even now, reason itself might prove too slow to stop the hangman's hand. The testimony of Thomas Wren altered the temperature of the case, though not, as I had hoped, its direction with immediate effect. Rather, it introduced a subtle distortion into a structure that had already hardened into near immovability. The law, I was beginning to understand, does not respond readily to suggestion, however reasonable, once its machinery has been set in motion. It requires proof of a weight and clarity that few human affairs can provide, and it regards even the most earnest doubt as an inconvenience unless it is buttressed by fact. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the challenge. The grimness that had marked his demeanor in recent weeks gave way to a more focused intensity, as though the presence of resistance itself sharpened his faculties. "A false narrative," he said to me one morning, "is like a well-laid road. Once people begin to travel it, they rarely question where it leads." "And how does one divert them?" I asked. "One does not divert," Holmes replied. "One collapses the road beneath their feet." Our first task was to test Wren's account against the known facts. Holmes retraced the clerk's route through Bloomsbury, timing each step, noting the play of light from the gas lamps, the pockets of shadow formed by recessed doorways and overhanging balconies. I accompanied him, notebook in hand, recording impressions that might later assume greater significance. "Observe," Holmes said, pausing near Montague Place, "how the corner here affords concealment. A man could wait, unseen, until the moment suited him, and depart without being observed," I added. "Precisely," Holmes said. "The witnesses heard an argument, but none reported seeing its conclusion. That silence is as eloquent as any testimony." We sought out Wren again, this time pressing him to walk the route with us. Under Holmes's guidance, the young man grew more confident, pointing out the precise spot where he had seen the stranger emerge. "He walked quickly," Wren said. "Not like someone fleeing, but like someone who knew he would not be pursued." "That suggests preparation," Holmes said quietly. Preparation was the word that haunted us in the days that followed. Holmes returned repeatedly to the idea that the murder had been designed not merely to eliminate Green, but to be interpreted in a particular way. The argument with Miles, the conspicuous presence of the clerk, the choice of weapon, all were elements in a narrative constructed to be read by a specific audience. "You," I said one evening. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and through me, the court." We next turned our attention to the bronze paperweight once more. Holmes borrowed it from police custody under the pretext of further analysis. For hours, he examined it beneath magnification, measuring the scratches, comparing them to marks found on Green's desk and shelves. "These scratches," he said at last, "are not consistent with a single violent act. They are cumulative." "You mean the paperweight was moved repeatedly?" I said. "Moved, placed, replaced," Holmes replied, "as one might do with a tool." "For concealing something," I ventured. "Or protecting something," Holmes said. "Consider this. The ledger was hidden beneath the blotter. The paperweight was used to keep the blotter flat. Whoever knew of the ledger would know the paperweight's significance and might use it to draw attention," I said slowly. Holmes nodded. "A visible object is an excellent distraction." The implications were disturbing. The murderer had not only known of the ledger's existence, but had anticipated Holmes's focus upon the weapon. By leaving it in place, marked with Miles's fingerprints from previous visits, he had provided a focal point around which suspicion could crystallize. We returned once more to the circle of scholars connected to Green. Holmes arranged interviews that were ostensibly academic in nature, probing opinions, rivalries, and private resentments. It was during one such visit that a new figure emerged from the periphery. Professor Lionel Brooke was a man of advancing years and declining reputation, whose work had been eclipsed by Green's authoritative pronouncements. He received us with a mixture of courtesy and bitterness, his rooms cluttered with books and papers in disarray. "Green made a career of correction," Brooke said sourly. "Correcting others, that is. He enjoyed it." "Did you ever suspect him of corruption?" Holmes asked. Brooke hesitated. "I suspected him of arrogance," he said, "but corruption requires proof." "And if proof existed?" Holmes pressed. Brooke's eyes flickered. "Then Green would have been vulnerable." As we left, Holmes was silent. Later, as we walked back through the darkening streets, he spoke. "Brooke lacks the decisiveness," he said, "and the intellect." "You think the murderer must be brilliant?" I said. "Not brilliant," Holmes corrected, "but precise. He understood not merely how I think, but how others believe I think. That distinction troubled me. It suggested a criminal who did not need to rival Holmes's intellect, but merely to anticipate its public reputation. The following day brought a setback. Lestrade informed us that Wren's testimony, while noted, was deemed insufficient to warrant a stay of execution. "Too vague," Lestrade said apologetically. "Too late." "How late is too late?" Holmes asked. Lestrade glanced away. "A week. A week." The word echoed in my mind with dreadful resonance. Holmes accepted the news with outward calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "We are no longer searching for truth alone," he said afterward. "We are racing time." That evening, Holmes did something unexpected. He wrote a letter, not to the authorities, but to the anonymous correspondent. He addressed it simply and placed it in a public letterbox, trusting, as he told me later, that it would reach its destination. "You relied upon my certainty," he wrote. now rely upon my doubt. 2 days passed without reply. Holmes continued his work relentlessly, revisiting old assumptions, testing them against new information. He reconstructed the timeline of the murder minute by minute, mapping movements across Bloomsbury with the precision of a military strategist. "Look here," he said at last, indicating a narrow interval between Miles's departure and Wren's sighting. "This window allows for a third party to enter and leave without overlap." "And the housekeeper?" I asked. "Unreliable through no fault of her own," Holmes replied. "Fear and routine are powerful anesthetics." On the third day, the reply arrived. "You doubt too late," the letter read. "The structure stands." Holmes read it twice, then smiled faintly. "On the contrary," he said, "it is beginning to crack." That night, Holmes summoned Lestrade once more and laid out his argument with careful restraint. He did not accuse, he demonstrated. He showed how the narrative had been shaped, how the evidence had been arranged to invite a particular conclusion, how the ledger's concealment and the weapon's placement suggested a mind at work beyond that of a desperate clerk. Lestrade listened in silence. "It's clever," he said at last, "but clever doesn't overturn verdicts." "No," Holmes agreed, "but proof does, and I am close." As Lestrade departed, Holmes turned to me, his face grave. "There is one more step," he said, "one that will either expose the murderer or confirm that I have failed." "And what is that?" I asked. Holmes extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. "I must force him to act," he said. The notion sent a chill through me. To provoke a criminal who had already demonstrated such foresight seemed perilous in the extreme. Yet Holmes's resolve was unmistakable. Outside, the city murmured on, indifferent to the lives balanced upon the edge of reason. Edgar Miles waited in his cell. The hangman prepared his rope. And somewhere, in a study lined with books or a room filled with shadows, the architect of the crime weighed his advantage. The road, though cracked, had not yet collapsed, and time, relentless as ever, continued its march toward an irrevocable dawn. Holmes's declaration that he intended to force the murderer to act filled me with a sense of foreboding I found difficult to conceal. In all our previous adventures, my friend had never deliberately courted danger without first securing some tangible advantage. That he now proposed to do so on the basis of inference alone suggested both the desperation of our circumstances and the precariousness of the ground upon which we stood. "You are contemplating a risk," I said carefully, as Holmes gathered his papers and sorted them into neat piles. "One which may place you directly in the murderer's path." Holmes did not look up. "The murderer has been in my path since the beginning, Watson. The difference is that until now, I have been walking where he intended me to walk." That evening, Holmes set in motion a plan so subtle in its construction that, had I not witnessed its genesis, I might never have recognized it as a trap at all. He composed a brief article for a minor scholarly journal, one with limited circulation, yet known to be read by precisely the sort of men whose reputations depended upon the opinions of others. The article was ostensibly a reflection upon the ethical obligations of antiquarians, but embedded within it were several pointed references to Green's practices, the ledger, and, most significantly, the possibility that evidence long thought lost might soon be made public. You are baiting him, I said. I am informing him, Holmes replied. There is a difference. A guilty conscience interprets information as threat. The article was published within 2 days. Holmes then waited. During this period, he maintained an outward calm that I found unsettling. He attended to minor cases, received clients, even played the violin in the evenings with an almost exaggerated serenity. Yet I knew him too well to be deceived. His mind was fixed upon a single point, listening, as it were, for the faintest echo of reaction. The reaction came sooner than I expected. On the third night after publication, Holmes received an invitation, formal, courteous, and handwritten. Professor Reginald Hawthorne requested Holmes's presence at his rooms, citing a desire to discuss the implications of the article and to offer information that might clarify certain misunderstandings. Holmes read the letter once, then handed it to me. "He has taken the bait," he said. "You believe Hawthorne to be the murderer?" I asked. "I believe Hawthorne is afraid," Holmes replied. "Whether that fear is justified remains to be seen." We arrived at Hawthorne's rooms shortly after 9. The scholar greeted us with a smile that failed to reach his eyes. He poured wine, gestured for us to sit, and launched into a measured critique of Holmes's article. "You suggest," Hawthorne said, "that Green's influence was abused, that reputations were traded like commodities." "I suggest," Holmes replied calmly, "that evidence exists to support that conclusion." Hawthorne's fingers tightened around his glass. "Evidence can be misinterpreted." "Indeed," Holmes said, "as can arguments." There followed a tense exchange, conducted beneath a veneer of civility so thin it was almost transparent. Hawthorne probed Holmes's intentions. Holmes, in turn, probed Hawthorne's reactions. Each sentence seemed to carry a double meaning, each pause a test. At last, Hawthorne set down his glass. "You are a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes," he said. "You disturb settled matters." "Truth is often unsettling," Holmes replied. Hawthorne laughed softly. "Truth," he said, "is what people agree to accept." As we departed, Holmes whispered to me, "Observe his hands. He is accustomed to control. He dislikes unpredictability." The following day brought confirmation that Holmes's maneuver had achieved its purpose. Lestrade arrived with news that an attempt had been made to access Green's sealed papers, an unauthorized intrusion, thwarted only by chance. "He wanted to see what you had," Lestrade said, "or to make sure you didn't. Or to remove something," Holmes added. Time, however, remained our enemy. The execution was now scheduled for 3 days hence. Holmes intensified his efforts, pressing Lestrade for a formal review of the case. The inspector was sympathetic but constrained. "You're asking the system to admit it made a mistake," Lestrade said. "That doesn't happen easily." "No," Holmes agreed, "but it happens." The anonymous correspondent reappeared once more, his tone markedly altered. "You force the issue," the letter read. "That is unwise." Holmes smiled grimly as he read it. "He is losing confidence," he said, "which means he is losing control." Holmes responded with a letter of his own, dispatched without ceremony. "You forced it first." That night, Holmes asked me to accompany him on a walk through Bloomsbury. The fog had returned, thick and oppressive, muffling sound and distorting distance. We retraced the route of the murder yet again, stopping at the shadowed corner Wren had indicated. "This is where it happened," Holmes said quietly. "Not the killing, but the decision." The decision to kill? I asked. No, Holmes said. The decision to let someone else take the blame. As we stood there, a figure emerged from the fog ahead, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with deliberate assurance. He paused upon seeing us, then approached. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I wondered how long it would be before we met like this." It was Hawthorne. Holmes regarded him steadily. "You followed us?" "Yes," Hawthorne said. "I wished to see how much you truly knew." "And now?" Holmes asked. Hawthorne smiled thinly. "Now, I know you are dangerous." "What you know," Holmes said, "is irrelevant. What matters is what you fear." Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Careful," he said. "You have no proof." "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But you have motive, opportunity, and, most tellingly, the need to control the narrative." Hawthorne laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Narratives," he said, "are powerful things." "And fragile," Holmes countered. For a moment, I feared violence. The fog pressed in around us, isolating the small circle of light cast by a nearby lamp. Hawthorne's gaze flicked briefly to the shadows, then back to Holmes. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he said. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "it is precisely because it has begun that it can be stopped." Hawthorne turned and vanished into the fog, leaving behind a sense of imminent reckoning. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was silent. At last, he spoke. "He will make a mistake," he said, "because he believes the structure still stands." "And if he does not?" I asked. Holmes looked at me, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "Then Edgar Miles will die," he said, "and I will have failed." The words hung between us, heavy and unspoken. For the first time since I had known him, Holmes acknowledged not merely the possibility of error, but its irreversible consequence. Outside, the city slept on, unaware of the quiet battle being waged within its fog-bound streets. A battle not only for a man's life, but for the integrity of reason itself. The night that followed Hawthorne's confrontation was one of restless vigilance. Holmes paced the sitting room of 221B Baker Street as I attempted, with little success, to read a periodical. Every tick of the clock seemed exaggerated, echoing through the room like a drumbeat that measured our dwindling time. Holmes's mind, as ever, had already leapt far ahead, pursuing pathways I could scarcely follow. "Watson," he said suddenly, pausing mid-step and fixing me with a look of intense scrutiny. "Tonight, the game changes. A shadow has been cast, and it is now my task to trace it to its source." I frowned, uncertain whether he spoke figuratively or literally. "A shadow, Holmes." "Literal, Watson, and moral. Observe," he said, gesturing toward the fogged window. "Bloomsbury is a theatre of whispers and half-seen movements. A single step, a flicker of light, can reveal much, if one knows what to seek." He drew the curtains aside and scrutinized the street below. The fog had thickened into a dense, suffocating mass that seemed almost alive. Gas lamps glimmered through it like watchful eyes, and the occasional carriage rattled over cobblestones with a mournful resonance. Holmes's gaze followed the uneven flow of shadows with an intensity that made my own eyes ache. "Do you see it?" he murmured. I peered down, but saw nothing beyond the fog-shrouded outlines of doorways and lampposts. "That," Holmes said, "a movement. Slight, irregular, a man circling the periphery of the lamp's glow. He is careful, but not careful enough." I squinted, straining to follow his line of sight. And you know it is Hawthorne. Not yet, he said, but I will know. We prepared immediately to follow. Holmes, dressed with meticulous precision, selecting his overcoat, hat, and gloves as though they were instruments of detection rather than mere clothing. I followed suit, feeling the weight of anticipation settle on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. We departed into the fog, silent and measured in our movements. The streets of Bloomsbury seemed transformed by the obscuring mist. Every corner hid possibilities. Every shadow promised revelation or danger. Holmes moved like a predator, his eyes scanning and calculating, ears attuned to the faintest sound. "Notice, Watson," he said in a low voice, "the patterns of light and shade. A man who knows he is observed will seek cover, but he leaves traces. A glint of a cufflink, the scrape of a shoe against stone." We traced the figure at a cautious distance. He led us through narrow lanes, past boarded shops and silent schools, past the old buildings that leaned against one another like exhausted giants. Holmes moved with the sureness of one entirely at ease in this labyrinth, while I struggled to maintain both silence and comprehension. Eventually, the figures paused in an alleyway beneath a flickering lamp. Holmes gestured for me to remain in the shadows while he advanced. "Hawthorne," he whispered, as if confirming my worst suspicions. The scholar, indeed, was revealed. He moved with deliberation, placing small objects upon the ground, examining them, and then retrieving them with care. Holmes observed all without betraying his presence. "He is working with the ledger," Holmes murmured, "or a copy thereof. See how he handles each item with a precision born of knowledge." I could barely breathe, both from the chill and from the intensity of the scene. What is he planning? "Control," Holmes replied. "He intends to manipulate the facts themselves, to rewrite the narrative so that Miles remains guilty and he remains unseen. The ledger is his instrument." We watched as Hawthorne pocketed the papers and moved on, circling back toward Montague Place. Holmes's eyes glimmered with both insight and concern. "We must act," he said, "but not directly. We must ensure he leaves a trace, Watson, one that cannot be denied." We returned to Baker Street, and Holmes immediately set to work. He devised a plan to place a marked copy of a document in the route Hawthorne had taken, knowing that the scholar's compulsive attention to detail would lead him to retrieve it. Simultaneously, we notified Lestrade of our presence near the scene, without revealing the purpose. That night, as we waited in concealment, Holmes explained the reasoning behind the maneuver. "A man who constructs a narrative with such precision," he said, "cannot resist correcting errors in his carefully curated world. If we place an error deliberately, he will act. In doing so, he exposes himself." Hours passed. The fog deepened until it became almost tangible, pressing against the buildings, the streets, and our own bodies. Every distant sound, a carriage, a dog barking, the scuff of feet against stone, set my nerves alight. Finally, a movement appeared. Hawthorne emerged from the mist, scanning the ground, his gaze sharp and measured. He approached the spot where Holmes had left the marked document. As predicted, he paused, bent over, and retrieved it, examining it with evident satisfaction and murmured mutterings of approval. Then, suddenly, he froze. Holmes had anticipated this. He stepped from his concealment and confronted Hawthorne directly, his presence commanding yet calm. "Professor Hawthorne," he said, "you have tampered with evidence and arranged circumstances to implicate an innocent man. Hawthorne's face paled, but retained an air of studied composure. "And what proof do you possess?" he demanded. Holmes held up the document, marked in a subtle but unmistakable manner. "You touched this tonight. Your movements, your decisions, every action you took was calculated to manipulate the ledger and the perception of Mr. Miles. You are not merely a scholar, you are the architect of a lie so intricate that it relied upon my reputation to succeed." Hawthorne's composure cracked, if only slightly. "You presume too much," he said, though his voice trembled. "No, sir," Holmes replied. "I presume nothing. I observe, and I have observed you." Hawthorne faltered, then made a sudden movement, an attempt to flee through the foggy street. Holmes reacted instantly, a single, precise movement bringing the scholar under control. "Watson," he said, as Hawthorne struggled briefly, "fetch the inspector. He will need to witness this." I ran for Lestrade, whose arrival within minutes added official weight to the scene. Hawthorne was taken into custody, protesting, threatening, and yet unable to escape the mounting evidence of his guilt. Back at Baker Street, Holmes finally allowed himself a measure of relief. "The shadow is caught," he said softly. "The narrative begins to unravel." Yet even as he spoke, I could not shake the knowledge that time was perilously short for Edgar Miles. Execution loomed like a blade, and even the capture of Hawthorne did not guarantee that our arguments and evidence would arrive in time to save him. Holmes stared into the fire for a long while, the glow reflecting in his eyes. "Watson," he said finally, "we have caught the man, but we must now dismantle the story he constructed, and that will be the most delicate work of all." I shivered, both from the chill of the room and the weight of the task that lay ahead. For the first time, it seemed, we were racing not merely against deception, but against inevitability itself. Outside, London lay under the cloak of fog, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within its streets. Somewhere in the darkness, the machinery of justice continued its relentless march, and the life of an innocent man depended entirely upon the skill, foresight, and moral courage of one detective, and his faithful companion. The capture of Hawthorne was a triumph, yet it brought with it no immediate comfort. If anything, the weight of our task seemed to press down more heavily, for the web of deception he had spun was vast, and each thread threatened to unravel with catastrophic consequence if mishandled. The life of Edgar Miles hung by a slender cord, and while Hawthorne's presence in custody offered hope, the ledger, the instrument around which the entire narrative had been constructed, remained a labyrinthine puzzle. We returned to Baker Street that evening, the fog thick around us, muffling the streets and swallowing familiar shapes. Holmes carried the ledger as though it were a living entity, delicate yet capable of harm. I followed closely, my own mind racing with the implications. How many others had been involved? How meticulously had Hawthorne arranged this entire scheme to misdirect us, to manipulate the perception of truth? "Watson," Holmes said as we entered, "observe the ledger not merely as a record, but as a key. The entries suggest not only corruption and manipulation, but a hierarchy of influence. Green, Hawthorne, and possibly others were enmeshed in a network where knowledge equated to power, and power demanded compliance. I seated myself opposite him, eager to assist, but also acutely aware that my own role was more observatory than analytical. Holmes, of course, treated me neither as pupil nor adversary, but as companion, offering the occasional explanation while leaving the complex deductions to his own formidable faculties. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the scratching of Holmes's pen as he cross-referenced names, dates, and transactions. Occasionally he would glance at me, his eyes sharp with the intensity of thought, as if testing my comprehension, or perhaps testing my patience. "Here," he said finally, pointing to an entry. "R. Hawthorne. Payment received for verification of Green's manuscript concerning the St. Bartholomew Codex. Date, August 12th. Now observe the sequence. Green's public correction of Fenwick's work immediately follows, as though orchestrated to establish credibility while concealing financial motivation." "And Miles?" I asked. "Where does he fit in this network?" Holmes shook his head. "He does not. He is peripheral by design, yet that is precisely why he was chosen as the scapegoat. The network's architect, Hawthorne, knew that by focusing suspicion on someone unconnected, he could operate invisibly. The implications chilled me. Miles had been condemned not because he was guilty, but because his profile suited the narrative Hawthorne had constructed. Every element, the quarrel, the fingerprints, the paperweight, the timing, had been selected to appear incriminating while concealing the true perpetrator. Holmes leaned back, the ledger open before him. "Observe this," he said, indicating a marginal annotation. Green notes a meeting with a third party, unidentified. The initials are smudged, but the date corresponds with the day before the murder. Whoever attended that meeting may have provided the catalyst for the act. We examined the ledger meticulously. Several names were conspicuously absent, yet each absence seemed deliberate, like the deliberate spaces in a musical score. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he began to sketch connections, a network of lines and nodes mapping relationships, motives, and opportunity. "This, Watson, is where the puzzle becomes perilous. The ledger is accurate in its accounting, yet incomplete. It shows what was recorded, not necessarily what was known. There are gaps that only observation or intuition can fill." I watched him, fascinated as he worked with almost artistic precision, transposing entries, connecting dates, hypothesizing interactions. The room was filled with the quiet intensity of his thought, broken only by the occasional cough from me or the subtle creak of the floorboards as he shifted position. The following day, Holmes insisted on visiting Wren again, this time accompanied by Lestrade. Wren, the young clerk, led us through the streets of Bloomsbury, retracing his observations from the night he had glimpsed Hawthorne near Montague Place. His memory, sharpened by repetition, provided additional details, gestures, posture, the way Hawthorne had scanned the street before moving on. Holmes was absorbed in these details, noting the subtle discrepancies between Wren's recollection and the earlier reports from the housekeeper. "Fear," he murmured, "distorts memory but does not erase it. There is consistency in the inconsistencies, Watson. That is our guide." By mid-afternoon, we returned to Baker Street. Holmes immediately set to work combining Wren's testimony with the ledger and our own observations. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. Hawthorne had been in Montague Place before the murder, under the pretense of scholarly inquiry. He had known of the ledger's concealment and had anticipated Miles's presence, arranging events so that suspicion would crystallize around the innocent clerk. "And yet," Holmes said, We must prove this. Mere reconstruction, however elegant, will not sway a court that has already passed judgment. Over the next 2 days, Holmes orchestrated a series of maneuvers designed to elicit further admissions from Hawthorne without direct confrontation. He sent messages through discreet channels, hinted at knowledge of transactions the scholar believed private, and even had the ledger itself misplaced in a manner that Hawthorne would be certain to notice. Each action was calculated, designed to provoke a misstep. The culmination occurred on a grey afternoon, with fog curling through the streets like smoke from a distant fire. Holmes had arranged a meeting with Hawthorne under the pretense of returning a document. As we arrived, we observed Hawthorne already present, pacing with the restlessness of a predator, aware that its prey is not as docile as expected. Holmes approached with deliberate calm. "Professor Hawthorne," he said, "I am here to return a document that you may find of interest." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "I see. And what is your true purpose, Mr. Holmes?" "To observe," Holmes replied smoothly, "and to record." Hawthorne's composure faltered slightly, a tiny flicker that only a trained eye could detect. He stepped back, glancing at the foggy street beyond, as if calculating his options. Holmes continued, "You have manipulated evidence and circumstance to implicate an innocent man. You relied upon my reputation, my methods, even my predictability. Yet predictability can be turned against you." For a long moment, silence held sway. Hawthorne's gaze darted, then fixed upon Holmes with a mixture of calculation and fear. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he adjusted the papers in his coat pocket. "You presume," he said finally, "that I acted alone." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps. Perhaps not. But even if others assisted, your hand guided the narrative." And there, amid the fog, the gaslight, and the quiet streets of Bloomsbury, Hawthorne's control began to crumble. One misstep, one faint admission would expose him fully. And Holmes, in his characteristic precision, was prepared to seize it. I realized then, with a mixture of dread and admiration, that we had entered the most dangerous phase of the case, one in which intellect and deception faced one another directly, and the fate of an innocent man depended upon a duel of minds played out in the shadows of London. Even as we observed, the world seemed suspended, every sound amplified, every movement fraught with consequence. The ledger lay between us, both evidence and instrument, a silent witness to the machinations of men who believed themselves untouchable. Holmes whispered to me, "Prepare yourself, Watson. The truth is about to step from shadow into light, and its impact will be profound." I understood the gravity of his words. For once, this was no mere pursuit of intellect or justice. It was a race against time, against design, and against the moral certainty of a man wrongfully condemned. Outside, the fog pressed close, as if London itself were holding its breath. The stage was set, and the final confrontation, though still unseen, had begun. The following morning, a pall of anxiety hung over Baker Street, heavier than any fog London could produce. Holmes had remained awake until near dawn, reviewing the ledger, Wren's testimony, and our observations from the previous day. I observed him from my armchair, noting the tight lines of his jaw and the restless movement of his fingers as they traced invisible patterns over the table. There was a tension in his expression I had rarely seen, a mixture of anticipation and calculation, and I realized that we had reached a point at which mere deduction would no longer suffice. Action was required, and the consequences of error were suddenly immense. "Watson," he said quietly, drawing my attention, "Hawthorne will act today. I can feel it. The subtle pressure we applied has begun to undermine his confidence. He believes the narrative still serves him, but his hand is no longer steady. One misstep will reveal him fully." "How can we be certain of this?" I asked, aware that certainty in the past had often been fragile. "Observation," Holmes replied simply, "and anticipation. Wren has done well, but we must now rely upon another instrument, the ledger itself, and Hawthorne's need to control its perception." We prepared immediately. Holmes arranged to have the ledger transported under the guise of securing it further from potential interference to a small room in Bloomsbury that he had rented for such purposes. He insisted that I accompany him, not merely as witness, but as participant, and together we carried the weighty folio along the fog-enshrouded streets. Each step seemed amplified by the quiet of the morning, and the city felt like a stage upon which every shadow might conceal both danger and revelation. Once inside the rented room, Holmes spread the ledger across the table, marking the pages we would use to provoke Hawthorne. He selected entries carefully, items whose misplacement, if noticed, would compel the scholar to act in a manner consistent with our expectations. We positioned the ledger so that it appeared accessible, yet in a manner that required deliberate attention to discover. "There," Holmes said, stepping back. "It is prepared. He cannot resist, for the ledger is his instrument and his obsession. By touching it, he exposes himself." I shivered at the logic, aware that the plan hinged upon a precise understanding of human psychology as much as upon evidence. Hours passed. We waited in silence, the fog pressing against the windows, the occasional cry of a street vendor, or the rumble of a carriage the only sounds. At last, footsteps approached, a measured pace, cautious yet deliberate. Hawthorne entered the room. His eyes immediately fell upon the ledger. He moved toward it, hands gloved, as if aware of the potential consequences, yet compelled by a need he could not resist. Holmes and I remained in the shadows, our presence unnoticed. Hawthorne retrieved a page, examined it, and muttered under his breath. Then, as if confirming a suspicion, he began rearranging the ledger, aligning the entries with meticulous precision, as though he could bend reality to his will through order alone. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "He cannot help himself. His obsession forces him to act. Every adjustment, every subtle touch is a confession in itself." Hawthorne paused suddenly, turning toward the door. His gaze swept the room, and in that moment, Holmes stepped forward. "Professor Hawthorne," he said, calmly but firmly, "I believe you understand the precarious position of Mr. Edgar Miles." Hawthorne's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of fear that passed like a shadow across his face. I do not understand," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Holmes advanced, placing a hand lightly on the table near the ledger. "You know full well, sir. You crafted a narrative designed with precision to implicate an innocent man. Every detail, the quarrel, the paperweight, the timing, was orchestrated so that suspicion would crystallize around him rather than yourself." Hawthorne's breathing grew shallow. He stepped back, bumping into the table, sending several loose papers fluttering to the floor. Holmes, ever observant, noted the pattern. The disturbance corresponded with entries in the ledger that Hawthorne had touched most recently, the pages where his fingerprints were likely to remain. "You have no proof," Hawthorne said, though his voice wavered. "Proof is cumulative, Professor," Holmes replied. "Observation, deduction, and your own compulsion to act. Each step you have taken has left an indelible trail." Hawthorne staggered slightly, then turned toward the window. The fog swirled beyond, obscuring the streets. "You presume too much, Holmes. I am careful. I am precise. No one can prove anything." "Except yourself," Holmes said quietly. "By your actions today, you have admitted to constructing the narrative, manipulating evidence, and relying upon my methods to misdirect justice. The ledger, your obsession, and your behavior are all evidence against you." Hawthorne's hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the table. I did it for scholarship," he cried suddenly, "to preserve the integrity of knowledge. Green, he would have corrupted everything. Miles, he was only a pawn, a trivial pawn." Holmes observed him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through every pretense. "And yet, in the process, you endangered a life. Edgar Miles is innocent. You calculated every movement to implicate him, and that is why you will answer for your actions." Hawthorne sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The confession, once forced, now spilled freely. He admitted to planning the murder in collaboration with another scholar, to ensuring that Miles's quarrel with Green coincided with the timing of the act, to manipulating witnesses subtly and planting the paperweight as an instrument of misdirection. Every revelation aligned with Holmes's deductions, confirming the intricate chain of reasoning we had painstakingly traced. I could scarcely believe what I heard. All this time, we had chased fragments, examined shadows, and relied upon deduction. But the full scope of Hawthorne's machinations exceeded even my imagination. The scholar had not only killed Green, but had built a complete architecture of deception around the act, exploiting human perception, legal procedures, and Holmes's own methods in a manner so clever it was almost poetic in its precision. Holmes spoke gently but firmly. "You understand, Professor, that your confession must be documented and conveyed to the proper authorities without delay. Mr. Miles's life depends upon it." Hawthorne nodded, tears streaking his face. I will do as you say, but can it undo what I have done?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "Not entirely, but truth, once revealed, allows justice to follow its proper course, and in this instance, it can spare an innocent man." I felt a tremor of relief mixed with lingering anxiety. The ledger lay before us, once a silent witness and instrument of manipulation, now transformed into a key to salvation. The fog outside seemed less oppressive, though London remained indifferent to the human drama unfolding within its streets. Holmes, as always, remained vigilant. "Watson," he said, "we have extracted the confession, but the work is not complete. We must deliver it, ensure its acceptance, and act swiftly if Miles is to survive." The hours that followed were tense. Holmes dictated the details of Hawthorne's confession to me, producing a written record to be delivered directly to Lestrade and the authorities. Each fact, each admission was noted with meticulous care. We then arranged for Hawthorne to be formally taken into custody, ensuring that his cooperation would be recognized and that the chain of evidence against him could withstand scrutiny. As the night descended once more upon Bloomsbury, I could sense a shift in the air. The narrative that had ensnared Miles was beginning to unravel. The shadow cast by Hawthorne's hand finally illuminated by the light of truth. Yet even in this moment of progress, I knew the danger was not entirely past. The machinery of justice moved slowly, and the life of an innocent man still depended upon the prompt acceptance of evidence, the credibility of witnesses, and the unassailable logic of Holmes's deductions. Holmes, however, displayed a calm I had not expected. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. "Watson," he said quietly, "the confession is secured, but the final measure of success will be the swiftness with which justice corrects itself. We must now ensure that Edgar Miles is freed before the rope takes its toll." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. For the first time in weeks, a sense of hope tempered the tension that had pressed upon us so relentlessly. And yet, I knew that the final steps would demand both precision and speed. For London's indifferent streets had witnessed much injustice already, and the shadow of time was unyielding. The stage was set for the last act, and the hour of reckoning for Edgar Miles approached with inexorable certainty. The night following Hawthorne's confession was one of the longest I can recall in all my years alongside Sherlock Holmes. The air in Baker Street was heavy, thick with smoke from his persistent tobacco and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. Holmes had retired early to his study to review the ledger and cross-reference the details of Hawthorne's admission with every witness statement, every note, and every subtle clue we had gathered since the first report of Green's murder. I sat in the sitting room, unable to rest, my mind spinning with the dire reality. Miles's execution loomed ever closer, and despite the confession, the machinery of the law moved slowly, inexorably. Holmes emerged just before midnight, the ledger under his arm, and an expression that carried both determination and unease. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have the confession, and it is authentic, yet there is a peril that shadows its promise. The authorities are not inclined to act swiftly. Miles's fate may yet hang in the balance, unless we intervene directly." I rose, conscious that the gravity of our task demanded more than mere observation. "What can we do, Holmes? Lestrade cannot expedite proceedings without risking scandal. And the Home Office." "The Home Office will listen to reason," Holmes interrupted. "If reason is delivered with precision, urgency, and irrefutable evidence. Time, Watson, is the enemy. We have but hours, perhaps only a few, before the rope will claim the innocent." We prepared immediately. I gathered writing materials, notes, and all documentation of Hawthorne's confession. Holmes, in his methodical manner, examined each item, scrutinized each line, every detail, every date, until he was satisfied that nothing was superfluous and nothing omitted. "It is crucial," Holmes explained, "that the evidence be presented not only in logical sequence, but in a manner that compels recognition. Any ambiguity will be fatal. The ledger, Hawthorne's written admission, Wren's testimony, all must converge flawlessly." We arranged for an immediate journey to Scotland Yard, but the fog had thickened overnight. London, as though conscious of the drama unfolding within its streets, shrouded every familiar landmark, rendering navigation treacherous. Holmes guided us with a precision born of habit, each turn, each street chosen to minimize delay. I struggled to keep pace, conscious of the weight upon my shoulders. Each step that did not bring us closer to Miles's salvation felt like a misstep in the calculus of life and death. Upon arrival at Scotland Yard, we found Lestrade waiting. His face bore the strain of urgency, his habitual brusqueness tempered by the gravity of the situation. "Holmes," he said immediately, "what have you?" Holmes presented the ledger and Hawthorne's written confession, arranging the pages and notes to demonstrate the intricate web of orchestration that had ensnared Miles. He explained, with deliberate calm, how Hawthorne had manipulated events, exploited witnesses, and constructed a narrative so convincing that it had relied upon Holmes himself as an instrument of misdirection. Lestrade examined the documents carefully, his brow furrowed. "This is remarkable," he admitted. "But even so, the court has acted. The sentence, the execution, can be stayed," Holmes interjected, "if immediate steps are taken. You have authority, Inspector. Delay, and an innocent man dies." Lestrade hesitated, as if weighing the enormity of the decision. Then, with a decisiveness born of shared understanding, he drew a telephone. Arrangements were made with the court for an emergency appeal, and the execution was temporarily stayed. Holmes allowed himself a brief nod, but I could see that his attention was already returning to the ledger and the sequence of events that had led us to this moment. He had not yet relaxed, nor would he until Miles was safely removed from the immediate threat of death. We next turned to verifying the authenticity of Hawthorne's confession and ensuring that it would withstand judicial scrutiny. Holmes dictated a formal statement to me, one that meticulously outlined every action, every observation, every deduction that had led to the identification of Hawthorne as the architect of the crime. It was a document of extraordinary detail and precision, leaving no room for doubt. "The challenge," Holmes explained, "is to translate intellectual certainty into procedural authority. Courts and juries require demonstration, not deduction alone. Every element must be supported by fact, corroborated by witness, or evidenced in writing." We arranged for Wren to provide a sworn testimony of his observation of Hawthorne on the night of the murder. His recollection, precise and consistent, now became a critical component of the case. Holmes instructed me to compile the timeline from the night of the murder to Hawthorne's capture, including every detail, every adjustment Hawthorne had made to the ledger, every observable misstep that exposed his hand. Each element was meticulously cross-referenced. By the time night fell, the emergency appeal was scheduled. Holmes and I arrived at the court just as the first light of the gas lamps began to flicker through the foggy panes. The city outside was muted, every sound absorbed by the dense mist that clung to streets and alleyways. Inside, the chamber was tense with anticipation. Lawyers, clerks, and officers of the court moving with the precise choreography that always accompanies legal proceedings of such consequence. Holmes presented the case, calmly yet insistently, highlighting Hawthorne's confession, the ledger's manipulations, and the corroborating testimony of Wren. He reconstructed the timeline in painstaking detail, demonstrating the deliberate orchestration of events that had led to Miles's wrongful conviction. The argument was not merely logical, it was almost theatrical in its precision, designed to compel recognition without appearing as artifice. The court listened, attentive and subdued. Witnesses corroborated the details, and the presentation left no room for ambiguity. The judge, a man of experience and gravitas, leaned forward, absorbing each point, his expression betraying a dawning comprehension of the complexity and subtlety of the case. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the judge spoke. The sentence against Edgar Miles was stayed, pending full review, and arrangements were made for his immediate transfer from prison. The relief that flooded over me was profound, yet tempered by the knowledge that the work was not yet complete. Miles remained at risk until the appeal could proceed in full, and the prosecution now faced the daunting task of confronting Hawthorne's confession and the ledger itself. Holmes, as ever, remained composed. He had guided the course of justice with intellect, observation, and an unerring understanding of human nature. Yet I noticed a rare shadow in his eyes, a recognition that even brilliance must contend with the inertia of legal machinery, that human error, pride, and preconception could still imperil the innocent. We returned to Baker Street late that evening, weary but alert. Miles had been moved to safety, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a measure of hope. Yet Holmes, reviewing the ledger once more, reminded me of the complexity of the human mind and the subtlety with which malice and ambition could intertwine. "Watson," he said quietly, "the narrative has been fractured, the shadow illuminated, and the innocent man spared for the present. Yet the full reckoning remains. Hawthorne's actions must be examined thoroughly, and the network he manipulated must be understood. Only then can justice be truly served." I nodded, understanding that our work, while momentarily victorious, was far from complete. Outside, London exhaled in the fog, unaware that within its streets and courts, a life had been saved not merely by law, but by intellect, perseverance, and the careful orchestration of truth itself. As I retired that night, the weight of the ledger, the confession, and the fragile life of Edgar Miles pressed upon my mind. Holmes's insight had prevailed, yet I knew that even now the shadow of uncertainty lingered. For every revelation illuminates, but it also casts new darkness, and the path to justice is rarely straightforward. In the stillness of Baker Street, I resolved to remain vigilant, for the final chapter of this intricate case had yet to be written, and the consequences of oversight, misjudgment, or delay could still be fatal. The morning following the temporary reprieve of Edgar Miles dawned with an unnatural stillness, as if London itself held its breath. Even the fog, which had clung so persistently to the streets, appeared to have withdrawn, leaving the city unusually sharp and distinct. Each street, building, and lamppost etched with clarity against the pale light of early winter. Baker Street seemed subdued, the usual hum of carriages and distant voices muted, as though the world recognized the gravity of the events unfolding within our city. Holmes, as ever, was already at work, his eyes fixed upon the ledger, tracing the intricate network of transactions and relationships that had orchestrated this most dangerous of misdirections. "Watson," he said without looking up, "we have managed to prevent a tragedy for the moment, but that is merely the first of several obstacles. The law, though now aware of Hawthorne's confession, will require exhaustive corroboration before absolving Miles entirely. And more importantly, we must uncover the full extent of Hawthorne's network. He did not act alone, and there are likely others whose complicity remains hidden. I nodded, understanding the urgency, yet apprehensive at the scale of what he implied. The ledger had revealed the calculated manipulations of one man. But Holmes's insight suggested that a far broader conspiracy had been at work. An intellectual conspiracy that had used the trappings of scholarship, friendship, and public reputation to cloak murder in a veneer of legitimacy. Holmes laid out the ledger in a meticulous fashion, isolating dates, payments, and communications, highlighting those that corresponded with particular manipulations designed to implicate Miles. He worked with the precision of a surgeon, cutting away irrelevancies and illuminating the patterns hidden within the seemingly mundane details of Green's and Hawthorne's correspondence. The ledger itself is remarkable, Holmes observed. It is both evidence and weapon. Its structure suggests not only the presence of premeditation, but also a deep understanding of human perception. Every entry, every omission has been calculated to guide suspicion, to create a narrative, a path that observers, police, witnesses, even myself, would follow unquestioningly. I was struck by the profundity of his insight. It is almost as if Hawthorne anticipated your every move, Holmes, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. And yet his genius is not infallible. In attempting to anticipate me, he underestimated the weight of observable fact and the instinctive responses of those unaccustomed to deception. Over the next several hours, we orchestrated a plan to trace the extended network that Hawthorne may have engaged. Holmes wrote letters and made discreet inquiries, instructing me to follow up on each lead, from minor collectors to minor scholars who had interacted with Green or Hawthorne. The information was painstakingly gathered, and patterns began to emerge that suggested the involvement of at least one other individual who had assisted in the orchestration of the events leading to Green's murder. At mid-afternoon, a messenger arrived with an urgent note from Wren. The young clerk had been surveilling one of the secondary figures identified in our investigation, a Mr. Adrian Peveril, a minor academic whose scholarly ambitions had long been constrained by Green's influence. According to Wren, Peveril had met Hawthorne multiple times in the weeks preceding the murder, always in secluded locations and always leaving with documents carefully concealed beneath their coats. Holmes examined the note with interest. "Watson," he said, "observe how Peveril is peripheral yet essential. Hawthorne's design required a second hand, someone who could provide logistical support while remaining unobtrusive. This is the hand that prepared the terrain, adjusted the circumstances, and ensured that Miles's presence could be exploited without complication. The complexity of the design struck me profoundly. So, Miles's guilt was entirely a construct." Holmes nodded gravely. Constructed, guided, and perfected. Yet the beauty of precision is that it leaves traces that can be followed if one knows what to seek. We immediately set out to verify Wren's observations. Traversing the fogless streets of Bloomsbury, we tracked the locations mentioned, cross-referencing them with the ledger and correspondence. The evidence aligned almost perfectly. Peveril had been present, moving as an assistant and facilitator, and, in some cases, actively contributing to the falsification of appearances that had framed Miles. Holmes's strategy was both patient and precise. He did not confront Peveril directly, but arranged circumstances in which Peveril's actions would reveal himself. A misdirected delivery, an ostensibly casual inquiry, and subtle observation were combined to create the conditions for Peveril to expose his involvement without awareness that he was doing so. By evening, we had accumulated sufficient evidence to demonstrate Peveril's complicity. Wren, Holmes, and I observed him arranging documents in a minor office near Russell Square. Holmes had carefully orchestrated the placement of certain items, ensuring that Peveril's habitual attention to detail would draw him into revealing his movements and interactions. Every careful motion, every moment of distraction confirmed our suspicions. Holmes's satisfaction was evident but tempered. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the meticulous nature of his actions. Each small movement betrays intention. Peveril believes himself clever, but cleverness without moral compass is fragile." Once Peveril's complicity was established, we returned to Baker Street to plan the final presentation of evidence to the authorities. Holmes dictated a comprehensive report outlining every facet of Hawthorne's orchestration and Peveril's assistance. The report was structured to leave no ambiguity, documenting the sequence of manipulations, the reliance on predictable human behavior, and the deliberate exploitation of Miles as a scapegoat. As night fell, the city seemed to hold its breath. London's gas lamps flickered against the deepening shadows of the streets, and the fog, though diminished, still pressed against corners and doorways, as if nature itself were conspiring to conceal the truth. Holmes, however, remained undeterred. "Watson," he said quietly, "the trap is now fully illuminated. The architecture of the crime, once hidden, stands revealed. We have the confession, the ledger, and corroborating evidence. All that remains is for the machinery of justice to respond before time runs out for Miles." I felt a shiver of apprehension. "And if the system delays?" "Then," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing with intensity, "we intervene. The law is our ally, but the preservation of an innocent life may yet require decisive action. We are at the final threshold, Watson. One misstep now, and all our work will be for naught." As I retired that night, the weight of anticipation pressed upon me. Every moment counted, every delay could be fatal, and the life of Edgar Miles still hung in the balance. Outside, London's streets were silent, yet the invisible machinery of destiny continued its inexorable movement. The stage was set for the final revelation, and the outcome of our painstaking investigation remained uncertain. But the threads were aligned, and Holmes, as ever, was prepared to follow them to their ultimate conclusion. Even in the quiet of Baker Street, the tension was almost tangible. The city seemed to exhale, waiting for the culmination of intellect, evidence, and moral urgency. Holmes's eyes, sharp and unwavering, reflected the firelight and the unyielding determination that had guided every step of this harrowing case. And somewhere, in the hidden corners of London, Hawthorne and Peveril, once so confident in their manipulations, were soon to learn that the smallest errors, when observed with the right eye, can unravel the most carefully constructed deceptions. The final act, I sensed, was approaching with the inexorability of fate itself. The morning of Edgar Miles's formal exoneration arrived with a chill wind sweeping through the streets of London, carrying a crispness that seemed almost symbolic of the clearing fog in Baker Street itself. Holmes and I rose early, prepared for the final proceedings, though we both understood that the ultimate battle had already been won in the quiet moments of observation, deduction, and meticulous preparation. The evidence against Hawthorne and Peveril, compiled through the ledger, Wren's testimony, and Hawthorne's own coerced admissions, left no room for doubt. Yet the machinery of law required careful navigation, and Holmes insisted upon accompanying Miles to ensure that no obstacle could obstruct the culmination of our work. The streets were busy, yet the air felt charged with anticipation. Carriages rattled across the cobbles, vendors shouted their wares, and the faint aroma of coal fires mingled with the mist that clung to the edges of the buildings. Holmes's eyes scanned every doorway, every passerby, as though anticipating some last desperate interference by those who had so carefully manipulated events. His hand rested lightly on my arm as we moved, and I recognized the tension in his gait. Not impatience, but the poised readiness of a mind prepared for any contingency. We arrived at the court well before the official hour, and the interior was a study in contrast, bustling with clerks, officers, and spectators, yet disciplined by the weight of legal process. The judge, a man of considerable stature and reputation, greeted us with an expression that blended curiosity and solemnity. Holmes, without affectation, presented the sequence of events: Hawthorne's confession, the ledger's manipulations, Peveril's involvement, and Wren's corroboration. Each element was laid out in meticulous order, supported by documentation and first-hand accounts. As Holmes spoke, the court was rapt. His voice was calm, measured, and precise, carrying with it the unmistakable authority of a man whose intellect had been honed through relentless practice. I watched Miles from the back of the chamber. The fear and despair that had marked his features for weeks were replaced by tentative hope, a fragile bloom of confidence that seemed almost miraculous. The man clutched my arm, his hands trembling, and whispered, "Do you think... will they believe him now?" I nodded, though my own heart raced with apprehension. Holmes continued, unfolding the intricate web of deception that had ensnared Miles. He demonstrated with patient clarity how Hawthorne had used knowledge of human behavior, the predictable routines of witnesses, and even Holmes's own reputation to manipulate events. Each detail, each subtle orchestration was exposed and contextualized, leaving the court with no alternative but to recognize the depth and precision of the criminal design. Then came the most delicate part, exposing Peveril's complicity without giving rise to counterclaims of coercion or speculation. Holmes navigated this with the finesse of a conductor leading a symphony, calling upon Wren and other witnesses to provide testimony of Peveril's presence, movements, and interactions with Hawthorne. Each statement was corroborated with documentary evidence from the ledger, leaving the court with a comprehensive understanding of the network that had been constructed to frame Miles. Hawthorne and Peveril, brought in under guard, displayed varying degrees of composure and fear. Hawthorne's arrogance had not entirely deserted him. He maintained a thin veneer of scholarly detachment, yet I could see the flickers of panic in his eyes. Peveril, less practiced in subterfuge, appeared pale and strained, struggling to maintain a semblance of dignity. Holmes, with the calm authority of one who had observed every motion and anticipated every reaction, addressed the court with a clarity that left both men exposed. He did not accuse with flair. He demonstrated connecting motive, opportunity, and action in a manner that could not be ignored. The judge listened, occasionally interjecting for clarification, his eyes betraying astonishment at the meticulous precision with which the case had been reconstructed. Each question Holmes answered with patience, never faltering, ensuring that every point was comprehensible and supported. The impact of the evidence, combined with the methodical logic of Holmes's presentation, was undeniable. After hours of testimony and careful review, the judge turned to issue a ruling. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, including confessions, corroborated testimony, and documentation demonstrating a deliberate and calculated orchestration to mislead the authorities, this court recognizes the innocence of Mr. Edgar Miles and formally annuls his conviction. Furthermore, Mr. Reginald Hawthorne and Mr. Adrian Peveril shall remain in custody to answer for their complicity in the murder of Mr. Septimus Green and the perversion of justice. A collective murmur passed through the chamber. Miles, nearly overwhelmed, turned to us with tears in his eyes. I offered my arm, and together we led him from the court to the quiet sanctuary of Baker Street, away from the bustle of the city. Holmes, for the first time in many weeks, allowed himself a momentary expression of satisfaction, though he remained vigilant, scanning the streets with his usual precision. Back at 221B, Miles finally spoke, his voice trembling with emotion. "I can scarcely comprehend it. After weeks of despair, to be freed. How can I ever repay you, Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson." Holmes waved a hand in gentle dismissal. "Repayment is unnecessary, Mr. Miles. Justice, when delayed, is still justice. You must now live, and your life shall be its own reward. But remember, attention to the smallest details and the courage to speak the truth are the tools by which innocence is preserved." I noticed then that Holmes was unusually reflective. He remained near the window, gazing out at the London streets, his face partially illuminated by the pale afternoon light. "Watson," he said softly, "this case serves as a reminder that intellect alone is not sufficient. Even the most brilliant deduction can be manipulated if human factors are misjudged. Pride, trust, and the assumption of clarity are powerful instruments in the hands of the unscrupulous. We must always guard against them." Miles, finally composed, departed Baker Street with a quiet dignity, accompanied by a sense of renewal and relief. Outside, the city continued its inexorable movement, yet the shadow that had hung over one innocent man had been lifted. The ledger, Hawthorne's confession, and the testimony of witnesses had corrected the course of justice, and the meticulous orchestration of truth had triumphed over the intricacies of deception. Holmes returned to his study, resuming his place beside the fire. I seated myself nearby, reflecting on the harrowing sequence of events that had brought us to this moment. "Holmes," I said, "I am left with awe, but also with a sense of unease. For though justice has prevailed, the complexity and subtlety of the manipulation are staggering. How many others remain unexposed, relying on the same knowledge of human predictability?" Holmes smiled faintly, a shadowed smile that carried both satisfaction and wariness. "Indeed, Watson, There will always be others who exploit certainty and perception, who shape reality to their advantage. But today, the innocent have been saved, and that is a victory worth acknowledging. Yet vigilance remains the eternal companion of reason. As I looked upon him, I felt a mixture of admiration and relief. For weeks, the case had tested every faculty, every observation, and every shred of moral courage we possessed. Yet, in the end, intellect, patience, and human understanding had prevailed. The city outside, indifferent yet vibrant, seemed somehow lighter, its fog less oppressive, its streets less foreboding. London had witnessed a triumph, not merely of law, but of reason itself, orchestrated with the precision, insight, and ethical rigor that only Sherlock Holmes could bring to bear. And though the ledger lay closed and the immediate danger had passed, I knew that the lessons of this case, the fragility of justice, the power of deception, and the responsibility of those who wield insight would remain with us forever. The quiet of Baker Street, finally settled, seemed to affirm it. For the first time in many weeks, the balance of intellect and morality had restored order, and an innocent man could breathe freely once more. Yet, even as the shadows lengthened outside, I knew, as Holmes did, that vigilance is eternal, and that the next challenge, whether hidden in the fog or cloaked in human cunning, would arrive with no warning, demanding the same acuity, patience, and courage that had saved Edgar Miles. This, then, was the conclusion not merely of a case, but of a testament, that truth, pursued relentlessly and without compromise, holds the power to overcome even the most intricate of lies.